On behalf of the JRP, I would like to welcome you to our second Talk Justice Tuesday event of the year. If this is you all first time joining us and you're unfamiliar with our coalition, just to give you a little background, the JRP, we are a coalition of 90 or more organizations and individuals working for meaningful criminal legal reform throughout the state of Georgia. Our coalition, we bring together directly impacted individuals, grassroots organizations, grass tops organizations, community organizers, activists, policy experts, all working together to work for a more just, equitable system for our state. Our Talk Justice Tuesday event, we focus on legislative and policy changes that are happening at the Georgia State Capitol or under the Gold Dome to focus on our communities that are affected by the criminal legal system. A couple wonderful things that I like to think about with our Talk Justice Tuesday events, that it gives us this opportunity to have intimate conversations during this session that breaks down a lot of complex policy issues for our audience. It offers an opportunity to amplify the voices that those of us who are directly impacted, formerly incarcerated people. It also gives us an opportunity to strategize for change and for advocacy opportunities like we're going to do tonight. We actually kicked off our series last month with our Legislative Advocacy 101, how everyday people can impact Georgia laws. If you missed our first webinar, we do have that recording available on our website, and we can share that information in the chat of how you can go back and view that recording. But tonight, you are here for a very great conversation about caught in between youth and the immigration issues that are going on today. A couple of things, though, before we get into that conversation. We have two upcoming Talk Justice Tuesdays that we would like to share with you that are be coming for March 11th and for April 8th. Our March 11th is going to be our post-crossover legislation review. So after crossover day, there are going to be some pending legislation that we want to tell you about. So join us for our March 11th Talk Justice Tuesday, and then our April 8th. So although our legislative session ends April 4th, come back and join us for our April 8th. This work is very hard, it's very taxing, but we have to all make sure that we take care of ourselves, decompress our self-care. So come back and join us for those two events, and we'll put that information in the chat of how you can register for those two events as well. So tonight, this evening, you're going to hear from a great panel of experts. We're going to talk about criminal, juvenile, immigration policy and effects that are happening for our families, particularly our children, and what's happening with the deportation policies that are happening, including the effects of the Lake and Riley Act. So I'm not going to get into our agenda because I'm going to let the experts, before I mess it up, I'm going to let them get into that tonight. A couple of housekeeping notes, though. We will have the chat open for resources and comments, but if you have specific questions, please utilize the Q&A functions on your device. We will have time for specific questions after the panelists get finished with the presentation. We'll have time to answer all of your questions. So a good friend of mine is going to get us started and moderate our title for tonight and our topic. Brian Nunez. Brian is a senior policy associate with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and he's going to guide our conversation for tonight. So I'm going to turn the panel over to Brian. We have a lot of panelists, and Brian is going to introduce all of them. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nikki. I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here today to discuss an issue that is deeply affecting countless lives across our nation. As threats of deportation and crackdowns on immigration intensified at both the federal and state levels, we are faced with a critical question. What happens to the young people caught in this crossfire? These individuals, often navigating the complexities of identity and belonging, are increasingly vulnerable to legislation that criminalizes their immigration status. Today, we are privileged to have with us a panel of experts in criminal, juvenile, and immigrant justice advocates who will shed light on the profound impact of these policies and explore how we can work together to protect and support those at risk. Let's dive into this urgent conversation and seek solutions that uphold justice, dignity, and humanity for all. With that, let's get started with introductions. Once again, my name is Brian Nunez, and I'm the Georgia Senior Policy Associate of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I have the privilege tonight to moderate this timely conversation. I will now pass it to the rest of the panelists to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about their work and organization, and then we will dive into the question part of the webinar. Let's kick it off with Stephanie and then go down the line. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian, and hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Alvarez-Jones. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Southeast Regional Attorney at the National Immigration Project, formerly at the Southern Poverty Law Center as well. The National Immigration Project is, in its term, a national organization that has, I'd say, kind of two components. On one side, we do a lot of advocacy work, including kind of policy advocacy, litigation, and other forms of advocacy in the immigration space. And then the other component of our work is to provide kind of technical support and in-depth analysis to immigration practitioners. So we are a membership organization, so we provide trainings and explainers to our members. My work is focused on the Southeast, kind of as the title entails. So I'm working to support immigrant communities and grassroots organizations. Particularly, my focus right now is Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and of course, here in Georgia, where I'm based. And I don't know who is next, but I can pass it over to Rosie, who's the next person I see on my screen, if that is helpful.
Thank you. Rosie?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rosie Harrison. I am the CEO of Grow Initiative Georgia, where we are a nonprofit organization and we provide services to non-native English speakers. And at this time, a lot of that are Spanish-speaking families and individuals with disabilities in terms of education, special education advocacy. We have our literacy programs for adults and children and health and nutrition programs. We currently serve 5 counties in Southeast Georgia. And we have a very intricate dual language and translanguaging program specifically for children. And we also provide a lot of seminars and education to our parents so that we're able to create a true unity or a true family unit that is equitably informed. Because as we all know, it's difficult to write the system if you are an English-speaking individual, but it is that much harder if you are a non-English-speaking individual and you also have either a child or a family member with disabilities. And I'm going to pass it out to the next person that I see, and that's Jean-Luc.
Hi, everyone. I am Jean-Luc Rivera. I'm the Deputy Executive Director over at Latino Community Fund Georgia. If you have not heard of us, we serve Latinos statewide across the state of Georgia through our civic participation work, our community reinvestment programs, and also through our health and well-being work. And my work in particular, I manage our legislative advocacy portfolio along with our special events and communications programs. And I will pass it over to Rosario.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Buenas, buenas. My name is Rosario Palacios. My pronouns are she, they, ella, ella. It's an honor to be here amongst such amazing individuals who I know give their full heart to this work. I am here with Georgia Familias Unidas. I'm the co-founder of Georgia Familias Unidas. We started out in 2019, actually as a response to the worst raids in the history of the United States that happened in Mississippi at poultry plants. Gainesville, Georgia is known as the poultry capital of the world, and we had a very bad scare a couple months after 660 plus families were deported in Mississippi, mind you, on the first day of school for the children in Mississippi. And so we started in Georgia as a grassroots organization, just trying to go out and do anti-disinformation work, checking in on raids, and trying to create a network for our poultry plant workers, of which I am formerly one and also the daughter of one. And so Georgia Familias Unidas, we focus on immigrant labor policies. We do advocacy work. We do immigrant rights work, and we do popular education work with our families to make sure that they have better access to the ecosystems that they contribute to. A really incredible thing that Georgia Familias Unidas, so something here in the South, right here in Georgia, that has been done with the help of many of the coalition folks who are here, is that we actually in 2021 became the first organization under the Biden administration that was granted deferred action for labor equity, for labor violations. And that actually led to some policy changes in the Biden administration, in the Department of Labor and the Department of Homeland Security. So it was a federal campaign that we won, and it was grassroots, and it was beautiful, and so many folks here helped out with it. But I'll talk more about some of that work later. I just wanted to highlight that, and I can pass it off to, I see next, Sofia Montes.
Thank you, Rosario. My name is Sofia Veronica Montes. I am a legal fellow with Project South. Project South, Institute to Eliminate Poverty and Genocide, was founded in 1986 with a work founded in the Southern Freedom Movement and the Black radical tradition of the United States South. Our purpose is to advance three strategic directions: community organizing for neighborhood power, movement organizing for regional power, and movement support for grassroots leadership. Our mission is to cultivate strong social movements in the US South that are powerful enough to contend with some of the most pressing and complicated social, economic, and political problems that we face today. In the Legal and Advocacy program, we work to connect movement lawyers with grassroots organizations and campaigns that are focused on dismantling state repression and protecting and defending communities of colors and immigrants, including Black, Brown, Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. The work is also focused on connecting with and supporting social justice movements in the Global South. Myself personally, my general work revolves around the area of utilities access and various restrictions that localities across the South have imposed on undocumented families to bar them from accessing essential services to water, electricity, and gas. More specifically, the Legal and Advocacy team during this time of the year has been monitoring the legislative session in Georgia, fighting back against bills targeting immigrant and communities of color, bills impacting movement building and organizing efforts, bills that increase surveillance and criminalize communities. We very much believe that movement lawyering is a foundation for a lot of our work in supporting grassroots partners and members in understanding these bills and educating them. So we monitor these bills daily, do legal analysis, create public fact sheets, and then sometimes testify in the Capitol or submit written testimony. With all that, I will pass it to Luis.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Thank you, everybody, for being here and the organizations that put it together. My name is Luis or Lucho Saliver. I am the state director for CASA. We're an immigrant rights organization based out of Maryland, and we've been here in Georgia for the last 3 years. Very much looking forward to have this conversation. Just to say that we represent about 1,500 community members here in Georgia. Most of them are undocumented. I will pass it. I think we all have gone, Brian.
Yes, thank you. I
Fantastic.
appreciate all of you for your introductions and giving a little brief analysis, of what y'all do. So thank you so much for that. Now we'll hop into the questions. And, as I had mentioned to the panelists, these questions are meant to be open-ended, so every panelist can add their piece as they feel is needed. And we'll start off with Stephanie. Can you please tell us what the impact of the Laken-Riley Act will be?
Sure. I think the short answer is that it's going to lead to more immigration detention. And it will also lead to many more lawsuits by unfriendly red state governments against the federal government when they disagree with. That's kind of expanding, that's a short answer. And then expanding on that, the Laken-Riley Act has these two distinct parts. The one part is that it expands the category of who is eligible for mandatory detention. Generally, ICE has the authority to detain anyone while they're in immigration proceedings, but certain people can be eligible for release on parole or for release on bond, for example. There has always been a category of folks that are subject to what's called mandatory detention, meaning that they have to be in detention during their immigration proceedings. And that is because they have committed certain crimes. does is that it vastly expands the category of who is subject to mandatory detention, meaning that more people are going to be placed in mandatory detention and have to fight their immigration cases in detention. I think the cruelest part, or one of the cruel parts, is that it's not just a conviction for one of these crimes. Even an arrest, a prior being charged, even if it doesn't lead to a conviction for something like shoplifting, leads to mandatory detention. And as folks know, right, like these lesser crimes like petty theft and shoplifting are like often pretty critical elements of the like prison pipeline. So I think that will lead, unfortunately, to many more people being detained. I will flag, though, that I think there are arguments. I think the law was just signed, is just now into effect, but there are arguments that we would encourage folks to make that children, juveniles are not subject to the Lake and Riley Act, and that crimes committed when you're under the age of 18 should not count for the purposes of the Lake and Riley Act.
Thank you. And I'll take a quick moderator privilege and ask, just because I know that you worked with us in SPLC and even Jean-Luc and Rosario. Can you tell us how HB 1105 from last session compares to the Lake and Riley Act? Are they the same? Can you tell us a little bit of the differences? I want this to be a kind of conversation, so tap in.
Sure, I'm happy to answer though if other folks feel free to jump in. But I think right, the problem is that unfortunately we're seeing the name of Lake and Riley being used in all of these kind of really perverse ways to just take advantage of a really horrible thing that happened to one person, and then just twist that name elsewhere. So the Lake and Riley Act in Georgia expands the intertwining, or it institutes the intertwining of local law enforcement, regular police, with immigration enforcement. Whereas the federal Lake and Riley Act deals with much more like nitty-gritty of immigration law, like who is subject to mandatory detention, who has to be issued a detainer, and giving state AGs certain powers to sue the federal government. So those are the two distinctions, but I'm sure my other colleagues can expand more.
So in terms of what it kind of constitutes in Southeast Georgia, especially in the rural areas and the rural counties, is that what we are seeing is that not having a driver's license or driving without a driver's license, that is criminalized. So that is allowing our police officers to detain families, detain parents. We have had an influx of families that are calling us because the mom, dad, or a sibling, which it's really sad to say, but even it's giving chances for racial profiling. We are seeing traffic stops where some of the first questions are, do you speak English? And are you a citizen? And I can say that because I was stopped last week twice in different counties. One of them, first question that came out of the police officer's mouth is, do you speak English? Followed by, do you have a driver's license? And what's your citizenship status? And I think that for individuals, especially in a vulnerable community such as the rural areas like the Bullock counties, the Effingham counties, and even parts of Chatham County, it's putting our families and our children at risk.
Thank you for giving us the perspective of what's happening here on the ground, Rosie. Now we're going to switch to Rosario. Can you please tell us how are the Trump administration's current deportation policies different from those during his first term? And what impact would these have on American-born children?
Right. That's a great question. So, his first term, President Trump didn't know how to do the thing he wanted to do, right? He didn't have always the folks in place that he needed to carry out the promises. Although we did see in his first 100 days in the first term, we saw an increase of over 50% in deportations from the previous administration, and in the rest of his administration, the increase was about 30%. And so what we're seeing this time around is that it's a bit more policy focused, right? You've seen the numerous executive orders that he's released, And you've probably seen too, the challenges then in court and how judges have upheld, right, that birthright citizenship isn't something that can be or should be ended. But we're seeing that he's, in addition to birthright citizenship, being able to declare a national emergency at the southern border, to be able to use his executive powers, right, is a newer tactic. Expanding enforcement policies, suspending the refugee admissions program. He rescinded a lot of Biden policies, including a really important one, and I know that you have this later on here. But there was a policy that protected against enforcement in sensitive areas like schools and healthcare facilities. That's probably the most alarming one. And, tying it into how this impacts U.S. citizen children. So I know the Pew Center estimates that about 4.4 million children in the United States have undocumented parents, or impacted through a nuclear family in this way. And so, definitely there, the separation of family members, to which, of course, the president has said that he will happily deport children with their parents, which is something that he was not as emboldened to say last time. And it did happen, right? Last time there was a lot of children separated who went into the foster care system, and then actually had a different pathway to be able to adjust status, whether they were in and out. But thinking through how this impacts our children, and this isn't just folks who have undocumented parents, folks who are legal permanent residents, right? Folks who are naturalized citizens are on high alert because in the last administration, we saw legal permanent residents be deported for instances of issues they had as minors, issues that happened 20, 30 years before, the same for naturalized citizens, right? Folks who had gone through the process, been fined for over a decade or so, suddenly there was like something that pops up, right, in their 20, 30-year history that has deported them. And so we're seeing a lot of fear. And what that leads to in a policy standpoint is healthcare. It's one of the most interesting things that I always find. So the number of folks that apply for food, housing, and healthcare, despite being able to actually qualify for them, decreases significantly when these kinds of massive fear-mongering, going nowhere policies go into place, right? And what does that mean? That means our children aren't able to go to a dentist at a young age, right? That means children with autism, children with different learning disabilities go undiagnosed for, into adulthood, right? And we know the impact of having less access to education and having, right, less of what you need to be able to succeed, and how that also plays out, right, with our over criminalized Black and Brown children. And so I could go on forever, but our children are, our children are at risk. Imagine not having food, housing, and the necessary healthcare, all the three things that you really need to be able to live in this country, and being denied that straight from the president without a care in the world.
Thank you for that, Rosario. Jean-Luc, Rosario alluded to it, but now that the safe girls are off, meaning that ICE can enter hospital, schools, courthouses, and hopefully that answered your question that I saw in the Q&A, churches, and any other place that has been protected, what are ways that we can keep people safe?
Yeah, and thank you, Rosario, for that intro there too for this. One of the biggest things we've been stressing over at LCF is just really making sure that folks know their rights, because it's the biggest thing we can actually do right now in terms of protecting this community. So leading Know Your Rights trainings is essential right now, and also the creation of documents and digital resources is also really essential as well, and making sure that you're disseminating those to the population, and that they're also easy to understand as well. So for example, having Know Your Rights cards that people can keep on them in their wallets with a number that they can actually call if anything is to happen to them, if they do have an engagement with ICE. And also being able to provide resources to legal aid as well is essential too. And one thing that we have been, stressing to the community as well, it's not a fun thing to talk about, but it's pre-deportation planning. Like have emergency plans in place in case something does happen to your family. Like who knows how to take care of your kids? Who knows what kind of medicine they need? Who knows, the passwords to your emails or your whatever accounts you have, just in case anything does happen to your family, something needs to be in place to where you can actually continue moving on and having that emergency plan in place for sure. Um, Also, I think documenting ICE encounters is really important right now as well. If folks do have an engagement with ICE or see ICE, substantiating that with a photo or video, if they're able to, if it's safe to do so, is really important to help cut down on, folks reporting they saw ICE in a certain area and kind of causing fear amongst the community without any real proof that they were actually there is important. Um, and then last but not least, I think for our non-immigrant friends, solidarity actions are the most important right now too. Being able to lean on non-immigrant allies to support immigrant neighbors in daily actions, whether it's, accompanying them to take their kids to school or going to the grocery store or going to the courthouse, whatever it is, having someone there who can back you up and be present as well is incredibly important. And I'm sure that my colleagues also have some more recommendations as well. So feel free to chime in.
Yes, Rosie.
Sorry, we've been saying that a lot. One of the things that we are doing is also we're connecting with our partner organizations like the Latino Community Fund to gain access to vital resources. One of the things that we do in our English classes for the adults is we have brought in different consulates, like the Mexican consulate coming to our English classes. There's actually an English class happening right now where they have dialed in and they're talking about prevention for our Mexican nationals that can look like participating in the Fina Bien card so they're able to access their money. One of the things that we have had are business owners that have been detained and are no longer in the country, letting individuals know, letting their spouse know and have access to those business accounts. Who do they owe money to? Who has contracts? As Latinos, we're very entrepreneurial. And that is a great thing for us. But we also need to make sure that we share that information, just like Jean-Luc was saying. And if you have a child or an adult with a disability, it is so important that we have the Medicaid information on file, especially if they receive any of the state waivers, like the Now in Comp or the Elderly and Disabled Waiver Program. If we have our children with disabilities, having their records, especially their 3-year assessments, are so crucial because until there is someone that's another responsible adult, if they is in the worst case scenario where the state has to come and they are now the guardians of that child has an IEP or that individualized education plan. And if that documentation isn't in order, there's going to be a lapse in services. There shouldn't be, but we are seeing that there are, especially now between January and the end of the year, it's IEP renewal season. So we're seeing a lot of individuals where their kids either don't have the necessary reports or the assessments, or there's a lapse in coverage in services. And when there is a lapse in services, teaching other family members or another trusted adult what those child accommodations and what those education benefits are, because they're still entitled to those services. We can still file for due process. We can still do an IEP meeting or a Section 504 meeting. I think it's also vital that we still remain in contact with other members and our partners that are supporting that, because in the state of Georgia, Section 504 has already been filed to be undone, for lack of better wording, and that is going to impact a lot of our kids.
Thank you, Rosie, and please don't apologize for chiming in. This is what we want. We want a conversation, and any expertise or a thing that you want to add, please feel free to chime in for the rest of the panelists. And we're gonna jump in next to Luis. Luis, can you tell us what mechanisms, if any, would be in place to ensure that deported parents can maintain contact with those children in the U.S.? Would there be any efforts to expedite the reunification of families if children are sent to live with deported parents abroad?
Yeah, well, I will let the attorneys here make more of the legal advice part of this because this gets into complicated situations when something like this happens. I do want to provide for the folks that are listening a little bit of the context of why this is happening because it has a direct result on what is going to happen with these orders, right? The A big chunk of what is happening is a reaction to the executive orders that Biden himself put out when he came into office. The family reunification executive order, for instance, one of the first things that has been resigned with this new executive order. The reason why they have done that is like, well, one, because they want to continue doing it, but two, they want to provide a new framework to provide more deportations and to continue with their agenda. This is why the executive order that they put out is called, something against an invasion. Because when you criminalize immigration, then all doors are open, right? For the judicial system, it is all up, it is open for the local police, and it is open for everybody to start looking at immigrants no longer as a community member, but as an invader. And what do you do with an invader? You throw them in jail. Their kids are not kids anymore. Their wives are not wives anymore. Like everybody, is committing a crime. That is why it was very important to listen to them during the campaign and to listen to them even now about how they keep on talking about criminals, right? They want to get through everybody's head that we're all criminals for being here. And if we're all criminals, then, everything expands. The first thing that the executive order did with Trump is resign the family reunification families, a couple hundred of them at least. The second one is, like I was saying, by criminalizing the parents, they're also criminalizing children. So it is a possibility that we're going to have people end up in the foster care system or people trying to get away from the foster care system as we move forward. And this is something that already happened here in Georgia a couple times, and we're likely to see it happen again if they move forward. The other thing that is worth talking about is the whole birthright citizenship part of this that they are trying to annul, as we know that now that it's not in the courts, it's likely going to go to the Supreme Court to see if birthright citizenship is going to be removed. But that is also another aspect that we have to think about kids, right? If the kid was born here, are they not before they had all the standing to stay, but now if they do push this end of birthright citizenship, then the deportations are going to be of the whole family, right? So those are the fears that we see happening. To your question is if there is going to be a campaign to reunite people, I want to be very frank to everybody listening to this. We have to put it a fight now, because if this passes, there are not going to be resources. Or I see it very hard for us as the nonprofit sector, movement leaders, lawyer firms. We are not going to have the logistics to find people in our country and find kids here and reunite them. It's going to be really, really hard. We are going to try. We can put together a campaign, but the fight has to happen now, especially if this goes to the Supreme Court, like in the case of birthright citizenship. I do want to encourage everybody to be ready to march for it this summer. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis, for the flag. Oh, so I thought somebody had gotten off mute. Okay, Sophia, how would the detention of parents awaiting deportation proceedings impact their American-born children, especially if parents are held for extended periods of time?
Thank you, Brian. So, based on our past knowledge of previous enforcement as such, we have to consider that people are scared, and this includes the youths. Entire families are scared across Georgia, across the entire country. This is also not an isolated phenomenon. This is a Friday scare, a trauma, let's call it what it is, that is built upon a series of various institutional traumas through the past several years, including but not limited to COVID being as significant, and especially the lack of COVID vaccination access for immigrant families being a major cause of economic and financial instability among migrant families. This is adding on top of that. The barriers to education that are becoming so ubiquitous in legislation. All of these various barriers that migrant families and migrant youth specifically are facing that are creating and fostering just this affective trauma that people are going through that is emerging and developing from older traumas. I would also be remiss to not mention how throughout the entire history of the United States, the separation of brown, black, and indigenous families has very much prevailed. Separation of black families, especially through the prison industrial complex, separation of indigenous families through boarding schools. The separation that we're seeing of migrant families is a more recent iteration of a phenomenon that is decades and centuries long. And so, how is this affecting these families in a more institutional sense? The fact that ICE now has greater presence on school, whether that be school networks, school connections, as well as physically in schools, because the memo protecting schools and churches has been rescinded. And so we have school staff, including faculty, including administration, very terrified, trying to safeguard their job security and their physical integrity from this federal enforcement, and very much finding themselves between a rock and a hard place. Do they comply with the federal enforcement agencies, or do they protect the children? And based on this very difficult question they are facing, that poses an additional layer of insecurity for our communities, that now teachers that are often seen as mentors, as protectors, you have to add that asterisk, that question mark. Can I trust my teacher to comply with FERPA, to keep my immigration status safe from the federal authorities? We have seen examples in southern Georgia of ICE already entering school campuses, questioning students about their immigration status. Another very important component is the discipline factor. The fact that when children are disciplined, oftentimes their parents are called into school. When their parents are called into school, when they're not at home, when they're not protected from warrants, aside from a judicial warrant, they are fair game for ICE to detain, or local enforcement that has any connection with ICE, such as by 287G enforcement memorandums of understanding. Detain the parents and hold an immigration detention. And so we are seeing these occur in various areas. It is a very uneven kind of enforcement because we have more progressive, let's call it that, counties like Cobb and Gwinnett that are more protective of students, generally speaking. And then we have other counties that are less protective and more ready to figure out or ascertain the immigration status of students and relay that information to an immigration enforcement. What has happened, what we have seen in in the previous Trump administration, was that when children are separated from their parents, when their parents are taken in, the children come back home alone, especially during extended periods of time, is CPS gets involved. And now we have children in the foster care system completely detached from their parents, suffering a completely separated fate, parents that have no say anymore on what is going to happen to these children. And so what are we anticipating? What do we anticipate will happen? Now, we anticipate that there's going to be significantly more ICE presence on campuses. Maybe even ICE detaining, stopping school buses, entering school buses. We cannot assure that any of these spaces are safe any further. Going further on my colleague's point about criminalization, Luis's point about criminalization, the fact that we are now seeing Guantanamo Bay being opened for immigration detention. So when everybody is a criminal, then how much is too much for the federal government? And we cannot very easily make that determination in a way that is very comfortable. So practically, what does that look like? What can you do for our youths? And it's just, yes, as the adults in the room, in the region, in the country, we have and we do partake in our responsibility to protect our youth as much as possible. And it is also important to come to terms with the fact that we have limited capacity. We do not have the capacity to protect every single youth in the state, let alone in the country. So it is very important to equip the youths with the knowledge and the resources and the networks that they need to maintain themselves safe. We still, as the adults, very much must have the priority of doing this work, while not forsaking the fact that the youth also need to have this information, also need to have these resources. That means bringing the youths that are, of course, developmentally capable of participating into our Know Your Rights workshops, figuring out how to educate the strategies for them to protect themselves. In the cases, as some of my colleagues mentioned earlier, of children that come back home and the parent has been detained, for the child to understand what the emergency plan is for themselves. Yes, very much adults in the area knowing also the emergency plan and how to care for the child, but in the cases where the child must rely on no one but their own very self, for the child to know how to do in those situations. For our various organizations that have our own youth programs, like many of ours do, to, of course, come together, but in a way that invites these youth to connect with each other, to share resources, to share information. And on the point of information, be very careful and very well capable of discerning what information is accurate from what information is not maliciously, but out of fear, out of panic, shared that is mistaken. How to make that discernment for themselves, and how to be able to connect with the organizers on the ground, nonprofits, organizations, etc., that can help them sort out what information is good from what information is not good. And so there's just all these many ways that we need to empower the youths to be able to protect themselves, while we still take very much the front line at protecting our youth. Understanding that if we cannot protect all of them, then they must know how to protect themselves.
Thank you, Sophia. I really appreciate the robust answer, to a very complicated issue. Now we're gonna go, and I think this was a great way to go to the next question for Rosie. How might schools and educators prepare to support American-born children who are affected by the increased detainments and deportations?
I think Sophia and John-Luc have done a great job at really kind of segueing into this. And first, I would like to invite the team and everyone here to have a little bit of an open mind when I say this. But just like my previous colleagues have said, not every school district is as protective, and not every teacher is as protective. There's unfortunately, and I think the more rural we go, the more that we see it, where there is a very clear line of what they feel is their patriotic duty, which sometimes includes recalling ICE themselves. And we are seeing that. We are seeing teachers that are being very open in social media about, I have students that are undocumented, and so and so and so and so. So some of the things that we do need to be very mindful of is absolutely, we need to educate our youth about what to do in case of an emergency and how to create an emergency plan. Have it in writing where the child knows where that plan is, but also educate the teachers that are considered safe. And one of the things that we are learning to do is how to probe if a teacher is safe. We have teachers and social workers that are calling us and saying, hey, what can I tell my families? And those teachers are the ones that we are identifying as being a safe adult or an ally, I guess you could say. And we are giving them the Know Your Rights cards that they're sharing they're sharing to their students and to the families. We're providing them with information about how to log doctor's appointments, medicines, doing the power of attorneys. I think that the part that it gets really tricky for us though is because teachers are afraid that they're going to lose their job out of compliance. And a lot of school districts that we have reached out personally, and we have either had a phone conversation, an email, or in person, the answers they vary from person to person. And I would like everyone that's part of the seminar to kind of be very aware of that. If one person tells you that no, they're not going to comply with ICE, but then someone else, let's say a superintendent or an assistant superintendent or even administration, that belief is not always across the board. So utilizing every possible resource to connect a family with a safe organization and understanding that we really need to be proactive at this point. We cannot be reactive. We have got to teach our kids how to contact the adult that is going to be entrusted to them in case they do come home and their parents are not home. Or like a case that we had in our county where a father was detained after he dropped off a student at a local high school. These are real life things that we have to prepare for, and also letting the teachers know that they have access and doing events, attending outreach activities, even going to the school activities themselves and posing yourself into that environment so that we are able to identify those individuals. I'm a firm believer that in every single school, I am very, very sure that there's going to be someone that is going to care and that we can provide that education and slip those Know Your Rights cards. Provide the Poverty Law Center guides, which is one of the items that we utilize the most, is the immigrant family guides, along with the power of attorneys and the affidavits that they have in that guide. Another part that I would say is let's really also focus on teaching our families technological literacy. Right now, it may not be safe for our families to travel to Atlanta, or it may not be safe for our families to travel to certain places because of the more openness of ICE and the collaboration between ICE and police. So a Zoom or a Google Meet is what we're utilizing, but we're also seeing that our families don't necessarily know how to utilize these services. So having our teachers send out a form, sit something out, be a little bit more intentional about how to utilize technology.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that perspective and everything when it comes to the schools. And now let's over to Rosario. What role could local communities and nonprofits play in providing resources or sanctuary for families at risk of deportation?
I want to pause and recognize that we have been talking about children leading their families. The parentification of children has been spoken about numerous times, right, for immigrant families. But the stakes feel higher. And so I have children, I have 4 children. And I've had to have discussions, right, for certain family members and things like that. And I lived undocumented the first 2 decades of my life. And so like this is not like a small thing. Our kids, 9-year-olds, 5-year-olds are having to memorize Know Your Rights, are having to look at peace officers, police officers, anyone in uniform and say, is that ICE, right? They have to learn how to identify. We're talking about judicial warrants to children, to 13-year-olds, right? Who should be just focused on their social life, their grades, how they're gonna, overachieve in high school. This is not the discussions that we need to be having as a country with our children. So I'll get off my soapbox, but it's, just to think of the enormous weight that I am seeing being placed on children just really gets to me. And so what I would say as local communities, one, we need to remember, I don't care where you stand on the immigration topic. Clearly, you know where I stand. We all need each other. This workforce we need each other. Gainesville's ecosystem relies on the poultry plants, right? Agriculture, the state of Georgia, right? The healthcare industry that is shortages in workforce, right? The boomer generation. Who is taking care of them? The workforces, the manual laborers, the clase laboral that is here upholding the base part of this country is being attacked and shaken up. And everything else that's on top, y'all, is gonna fall. So as local communities, we need to be there for each other. We need to look at immigrant children's around us. We need to remember, right, that those are also the children of the society that we depend on, right? And we're going to depend on them even more as we age, especially with the broken healthcare system of this country. And so I also want us to remember as local communities what all of these things, even policies that the President Trump's team knows are going to fail, why do they still put them out there? This is about messaging. This is about getting psychologically to these communities saying you don't belong. I'm sorry, sir, but I've belonged to this continent for millennia. My ancestors, my indigenous ancestors, have traveled up and down this continent. They were displaced, right? When the colonization of the United States happened, we belong here, right? This country belongs to all of us. And I refuse to be othered. I refuse to perpetuate these messages of not belonging. And that's what is being sent to our children with the state level anti-immigrant legislation for children in K through 12. What you're really signaling is you don't belong here, right? And so we need to do the opposite of that. We need to be prideful in the beauty of the diversity of the community that exists within us. I'll get off the theoretical stuff. As nonprofits, what I saw in the last administration is that really bringing communities together, how we're giving them the tools and then letting them come up with the solutions, right? They're the ones most directly impacted. Nonprofits are resources, and they receive the resources. They receive the tax breaks of the rich, right? The unpaid profits of our people. So let's give it back, right? Anywhere we can. Also, let's make sure we empower folks, not just a Know Your Rights training. What about a Train the Trainer on Know Your Rights, right? Where these organizers can go in and actually go to churches, right? That's something we've done in Gainesville. We've done Train the Trainer so that folks who are trusted by their church can go and do the presentations. That way a church isn't seeing some kind of political agenda that may or may not be there. Right? We need to empower our community directly. And then lastly, what I really saw that was useful, y'all, our children are being disrupted in school. There's been 2 Mondays in Hall County where children in large numbers did not attend. 2 Mondays ago is because there was rumors about an ICE raid that turned out to be false. And then this last Monday, right, not this week, but the one before, Un Día Sin Inmigrantes, right, that was felt across the state. Our children are losing out on vital educational opportunities. What needs to happen is our community needs to be able to be given platforms to be able to come together, to be the resourceful collective communities that they've always brought. And what we did last time around is we helped folks introduce themselves. We taught them pod programs during the pandemic. Our folks didn't stop working. They were essential workers. So they had no one to take care of their kids, much less be able to help them log on to Zoom, right? So creating pods in these communities, I think, is another thing. But us helping teach different tactics, giving the resource directly to the community who's most impacted, that's what we need to be doing, and then getting out of the way.
Yeah, thank you, Rosario, for grounding us with that answer for sure. And Jean-Luc, can you tell us what role could advocacy groups, faith-based organizations, and grassroots movements play in opposing or mitigating the effects of increased deportations?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things that a lot of folks in the advocacy space can do, whether you're a nonprofit, think tank, etc. It's just using your understanding of policy. Like, you're in that role for a reason. You know how to read policy. It can be tricky to understand sometimes, and using that influence to, one, advocate on behalf of the community, but also, if you're registered, lobby as well and get deeper into the weeds there, actually talking to legislators and doing the work that needs to be done in regards to changes in immigration laws. And Sometimes that is, a hard stance of no, we don't like this bill, but also sometimes it is harm mitigation as well, and seeing what you can do to protect the community if you know something is actually going to advance regardless. So using your judgment there and also privilege in terms of being able to actually understand policy and help the community in that aspect, but also then taking that and helping the community understand what the policy means as well. That is so important. And making sure when you are putting out resources, digital, printed, whatever it is, the call to action you do, making sure that it's bite-sized information that actually gets the point across quickly and efficiently, because if you have an Instagram post that's popping up quickly regarding immigration policy, odds are someone's going to see it one time, and that first time they see it, you want it to be information that they can get immediately and then be able to say, okay, how can I help with this quickly? Um, so being able to provide those quick and easy call to actions that are easy to understand. And once again, like I said, providing legal aid and support is crucial in this time as well. Compiling a list of immigration attorneys that are willing to work with nonprofits and advocacy groups is great. Um, Kind of going back to what Rosario said regarding the impact this is having on kids in terms of the psychological impact. I think the space where advocacy groups and faith-based groups can kind of step in here as well is by providing community and emotional support. There is a lot of trauma that comes with being thrust into a caretaker role. One, the loss of your caretaker at a young age, and then two, having to adjust and grow up before you're ready to grow up. I mean, you don't have the chance to be a kid. It's traumatizing. You have to make family decisions. You have to budget. You have to, sit there and take care of your siblings. So really leaning on those faith-based and advocacy groups to provide whatever community emotional support it is. Perhaps there is a way for nonprofits and advocacy groups and churches and temples to provide any type of mental health therapy as well. I think that would be crucial. Um, and of course, the last piece is just coalition building. Right now, our community is what we have, and we have to strengthen our coalition and make sure we're able to work together effectively. Because when it comes down to it, communities, it's what's going to get us through this for sure. So being able to organize effectively and take care of each other, and that might look like, having a shoulder to cry on or being able to provide mutual aid for each other, especially once again, leaning on those non-immigrant allies who are able to actually step in and help when our immigrant neighbors need help for sure.
Thank you, Gianluca, for that. Stephanie, how will existing protections such as deferred action for childhood arrivals, better known as DACA, or temporary protected status, better known as TPS, be affected?
That's a good question, and I think unfortunately the short answer is that we don't know yet. We saw in the last Trump administration that there were the attacks on DACA, right? DACA was paused. TPS status for a lot of folks was not extended and rescinded, and I think we're already seeing some of that, right? So I think the first kind of iteration of this that we've seen so far is that the extension there is no longer an extension for TPS for Venezuelans. And so that first group of folks that got TPS for Venezuela, I think back in 2023, that period now, that kind of protection now expires in April. There are other folks who got TPS for Venezuela at different points in time, and that status would remain, but I think it's in jeopardy. I would say that the broader scope is that some of the messaging that I think we heard in the lead up to the election, right? It's like, we're just going to go after the criminals, right? Or just like if you have your green card, you're fine, right? Like folks with certain status, you're fine. I think the mask is off, and I think we need to recognize that the mask is off, and that any at a baseline level, any non-citizen, regardless if you have any kind of documentation or not, there is risk. There is risk. And even to a certain level, naturalized citizens are at risk. So I think that's just, something to be really mindful of, that is this dissonance of the messaging that I think people also inherently believe that, no, I have no criminal records, right? I've never done anything wrong. I've never even gotten a traffic ticket. So I'm not at risk, right? I'm just here to work and support my family. And unfortunately, we're seeing that that's just not true. And I'll just quickly answer the question on DACA. You know, there is the kind of long and ongoing case out of Texas that challenges the legality of the DACA program. You know, right now it's in a little bit of a status quo in that folks can still seek to renew existing DACA applications, but no new folks are eligible to apply. And, you know, whether or not Trump does anything with those folks that have been applying for renewals, whether or not people can still ultimately seek renewals, I think will remain to be seen and will almost certainly be subject to further litigation.
Thank you for that, Stephanie. And now, if this question is more open-ended for Sophia, Luis, and Rosie, how would you change the media coverage when it comes to family separations to influence the national conversation on immigration policy?
So one of the things that I would suggest is we need to humanize them. Just like my colleagues have stated before, by criminalizing immigrants, we are being dehumanized. And as we're dehumanized, they create this barrier between our family and what we perceive as our family and what they perceive as their family. So one of the things that I would like, and I think that would probably create a bigger impact, it's let's humanize it. Let's bring back the effect of it's not criminals and it's not just criminals like the rapists and the felonies or the felons that are being deported. It's your best friend that you have tacos with on Friday nights. It's your your sister from another mister that you have shared these commonalities of boyfriends breaking up. Let's show them that it's like real people. And I happen to be in Atlanta over the last few days, and there is a huge separation between Hispanics and people that recognize that. People were making very open and very clear remarks about illegal documents and about Mexicans. And when I tell them, well, hold on a second, I'm Mexican. And you know me, I'm not a murderer. Oh, well, you're different. And then that gave us a chance to explain how things are being politicized and how the media is making us look like we really are less than human and we are sub-citizens. So I think we need to be honest about taking ownership and accountability within our own community and call us for what we are. Just because we're documented, it does not make us any better person. Or just because we are a birthright citizen doesn't mean anything. I had to explain to individuals that, hey, well, I'm an immigrant. My parents were immigrants. My kids are first generation. If birthright ends, depending on how this goes out, my children would also not be considered US citizens. And my children. So I think that we really do need to make it personal.
So I would add to all of that that there is what I think the media should do, and there is what I think the media is likely to do. And under our neoliberal economy, what drives media coverage and reporting is less so altruistic call to raise public awareness and more so ratings and profit. So the media is a particularly reactionary arm of the public discourse at this point, uh, both on the basis of some outlets, and these are all blanket statements. Maybe you can identify an outlet that's like, well, that one's not like that, but I'm talking in general terms. The more right-wing outlets are wanting to out right-wing each other and gain as much favor from the Trump administration and attention as they possibly can because that boosts ratings. And the maybe less right-wing, even centrist, even left-wing outlets that are on the scene are seeing some exclusion from presidential White House reporting, precisely because of a more critical nature that the federal government does not very much appreciate. And so the media is very much left with that uh, choice for them to make. Are they going to be more amicable to the current administration, or are they going to fade into irrelevance? And so that is a rather, in my impression, an unreliable avenue for us to pursue that media connection in very general terms, barring maybe some specific examples. But it seems that, to me at least, social media is a more, and yes, more volatile, but also more responsive avenue for us to connect and share this information. And when I say more volatile, it's that couple things. Number one, going back to the matter of disinformation and misinformation, the fact that so much incorrect information is being shared on social media that is raising panic. Again, not necessarily out of any malice, but just out of that's what people see, that's what people react to. And number two, the fact that we are seeing very big media, social media outlets like Twitter or, sorry, X or Facebook, uh, changing their policies to be more in line to whatever the Trump administration would favor. And so we have to have a pulse on what our communities and the youths, more topical to this conversation, are in tune with. TikTok being a big one that the federal government very much has targeted. Instagram to a lesser extent, but still generally very popular. And using social media as a means to empower our youths to communicate with each other and share this information, collect and share this information with each other in a way that we would not rely on more established media sources to do.
Did you want anything, Luis, to the question?
No, I mean, it's agreement. We has been said. I would just like to add that I personally checked in my close friends and family who are directly affected by all of this, and I also sense a lot of resilience, a lot of fight, in the sense like, well, if they're gonna kick me out, just figure something out or just go somewhere else, I mean, among our families, among our community. While there is fear, I also see a lot of defiance, and I wish the media and other people also will be talking about that part of our communities because it's a big part of who we are and a big part of how we are going to approach of this and how we're going to come together, right, for whatever happens. And anybody who is an ally or that works in an organization or the volunteer somewhere, if you want to help our community besides all the other ways that this wonderful panel has discussed of being informed and so forth, is also to uplift that resilience and natural way of approaching life that immigrant communities have. Certainly, that was my mom. Certainly, that has been my family, and I hope that if they're gonna kick us out, we're not gonna we're not gonna leave, with sad faces and crying. We are gonna go with our foreheads way up.
And I'll take one last moderator privilege, but I want, Rosario and Jean-Luc to just give a small, preview of what they're seeing down at the Capitol under the Gold Dome on when it comes to anti-immigration legislation this time around. Because just for everybody's knowledge, all legislation in this year is a biennial, so all legislation has to be reintroduced from last year. So it's a new year or new 2-year period. So what are some of the things that you're seeing pop up once again or are new with the current environment?
I can give a quick intro, then let you dive in a little deeper if you want to. A theme that I've noticed this year is a bit more of our legislators being a little bit sneaky with how they're being anti-immigrant within legislation. There, of course, are some bills that are very outright anti-immigrant bills, such as Senate Bill 21, which is actually moving to the floor tomorrow in the Senate. And um, there is another bill that's actually pretty similar to 1105 from last year as well. But more so just like sneaking in language that does target immigrants in different ways, and it's actually just affecting livelihood altogether now. And one of the big components is education. And This is through HB 18, which is affecting dual enrollment for students, and changing what it looks like to be able to access dual enrollment by changing the wording within the code to be a legal resident of the state. So it's kind of like those sneaky ways to kind of shift um, the legislation by using precise language to then exclude immigrant population or undocumented folks from having the same resources as anyone else. And I will let you elaborate a little bit more, Rosario, if you'd like to.
Right. Thank you, Jean-Luc. Yeah, there's so much, I think I've counted about 7 or 8 legislation so far that's directly that there's like a clear nexus with how it would impact immigrants. It's interesting because, last year with 1105 passing, right, trying to expand what programs like 287G have done in the state. And for anyone that, is trying to also pinpoint, the way I describe 287G is it's an optional collaboration with ICE, right? That people have chosen to opt into, and it deputizes police officers as ICE agents. And so, it's interesting how state legislators are trying to codify things that already exist on a federal level and expand them even more and make them even more ridiculous and unsustainable because the systems that they are impacting aren't set up to be able to target folks the way that they want. I think through a lot, things like HB 18 is a clear signal like you don't belong, and an attack to children. Why are we even talking about children in any grade K through 12? But there's interesting ones like SB 29, where DNA sampling of folks in detention centers is now something that they want to introduce. That was a newer one. And then punishing municipalities and local governments, sheriffs who aren't implementing HB 1105, the massive, show me your papers type of legislation, right? Being able to be punitive even amongst each other, right? And then opening up municipalities for lawsuits. There's just so much at the state capitol. You would think that with the executive orders and the federal leniency to be anti-immigrant, the state of Georgia wouldn't feel such a need to codify things on a state level. But we know that every single one of these tactics has been used on Black Americans for decades in this state. The criminalization of moving violations, that is the biggest deportation pipeline in my hometown, that was a clearly racial targeted legislation that also helped them target immigrants. And so Georgia persists.
Thank you so much for both of you. And now we'll diving into the last question before we dive into the Q&A from the viewers. Can you tell us, and this is for everyone on the call, so please feel free to jump in. Can you tell us what long-term societal consequences might arise from the deportation of parents of American-born children, particularly in terms of community cohesion and trust in government? Are there historical parallels or lessons from past immigration enforcement actions that could inform the handling of family separations?
I think that one way that we're going to see this impact is going to be health. We already know that statistically Hispanics have decreased access and less equitable access to healthcare. So our kids are not going to want to go to get preventative care, I think we're going to see a spike in mental health, specifically depression and anxiety, especially with the younger generation. I think that, just like Rosario had mentioned, with parentification, we're also going to see a huge decline in social emotional regulation. And the same thing that happened in COVID. We're still seeing the effects of the kids. The last time that they went to school, for a lot of the kids, they're going to be emotionally delayed, and they were emotionally and academically delayed. So when we take that into consideration, plus taking into account that Georgia already does not have the resources for adequate CPS and for adequate APS, CPS being Child Protective Services and APS being Adult Protective Services, when we take into consideration all children, but also our children and young adults with disabilities, it's going it's going to make society is going to make the quality of life for our community and those within the community that are also vulnerable. It's going to impact their quality of life and their ability to lead fully fulfilling lives. And then we're going to see that in the workforce. We're going to see that in every aspect because, as we all know, everything intersects.
I think also going off of that, is that there's going to be a huge lack of trust within or with law enforcement as well, because folks are just not going to want to engage with law enforcement out of fear, which is going to lead to a decrease in the reporting of crimes and also just an increase of violence happening within immigrant communities as well. And that's just not really knowing about it as well, because folks aren't going to be able to feel safe enough to report those crimes from happening, or that they are happening rather. So that's another piece we should be aware of too.
Then also piggybacking off of that, one of the things that I think we also need to be very conscientious about is that Georgia does have a very high sex trafficking rate. And our community right now is going to be severely impacted because of what Jean-Luc mentioned with the lack of trust in law enforcement. So our community is going to be targeted. If our children, we have individuals that are pretending to be ICE that are trying to get into people's homes, children will be taken, and then we are going to have missing children. We're going to have families that are going to experience sexual and physical violence. And we continue to have a decline in all the social factors that are supposed to be making our communities more resilient. Within that, we also, I mean, in general, right? I think that even as millennials, we can say that we have gone through those stages where we're finally starting to accept mental health within the community and asking for help, recognizing things before they come into a crisis. Now we're getting to the point where all that work, unfortunately, I feel like it's going to get washed away.
Poverty is violence. And whenever you can perpetuate poverty, better, you're committing acts of violence. And so our communities being separated from their families, again, we know the history of this country on separation of families. We know how that has, impacted so much our Black Americans. We know how colonization, from the inception of this country, right, sought to break up families, the nuclear home, right? There's theorists out there who believe the development of like the nuclear family was a tool for economic mobility. And so these types of destructions of families are going to be felt for generations to come. And that creates a larger divide between the 1%, the ruling class, right? And us. And, on a more immediate level, the trauma that immigrants face, the need to be able to go back and forth between multiple cultures, right, and be able to translate it all, even if you're speaking it in the same language, it is heavy for our kids. Latinas as a demographic, Latina, like femme presenting folks, have the highest suicide rate in this country. The impact on women of color that parentification usually falls on first is felt forever, right? And so how does that play out in adulthood, right? Undiagnosed learning disabilities that you had to push through, right? The perpetuation of trauma onto other generations, right? Because you haven't had the time to heal what you lived through. And all of us are intertwined. There's not a single demographic in this country that is going to be unimpacted by the psychological and economical costs of this hateful anti-immigrant rhetoric.
Thank you so much. And are there, just before we jump into any remaining questions that the audience might have, are there any calls to action for the people that may have, not asked a question that you want to put out? And we can go down the line of panelists, but any calls to action that you feel will be pertinent or good for everybody to know? I'll start with Stephanie.
Oh gosh, I think it's twofold for me. I'd say folks that have any kind of privilege, right? Citizenship status is a privilege at this point. White presenting is a privilege at this point. For those folks to get involved kind of in whatever local and grassroots efforts might exist around you, and they look different. ICE watchers, ICE watch efforts, I think, are really critical, and just kind of keeping the community informed about where ICE enforcement actions are, and like having folks that can go out there and confirm ICE enforcement actions are like really critical, and like having someone who feels safe doing so is really important. So I think that would be one call to action of like having folks plug into those local networks as they may exist. I would say secondarily would be to like participate in like state and federal legislative politics. As folks mentioned, right, there are these like nasty bills in the Georgia legislature right now. And yes, a lot of legislatures have already made up their mind, but we can be loud about it. And we can let them like not let them go quietly. And so calling and making sure voices are heard in opposition to these bad bills. And on the federal level as well. In the coming weeks, we're going to see bills targeting sanctuary cities and states, and like stripping away really critical funding, like funding Meals on Wheels, educational medical funding for states that are friendly to their non-citizen residents. And so making sure that like at the national level, your state reps and state senators like hear from you. I think it's important.
Thank you, Stephanie. Sophia?
I very much echo the call to contact and connect with rapid response networks in your area. If you have the capacity to participate within the rapid response network, that only strengthens it. And if you don't have the capacity, or at least you have your regular capacity, that'll at least give you some awareness of what is going on where. Very much connect with either nonprofit or private attorneys, immigration attorneys specifically, that adhere to the principles of movement lawyering and community lawyering. Just having that line that will help to whatever extent necessary, either prevent or mitigate the impact of immigration detention and hopefully even deportation. Very much reach out to your local National Lawyers Guild if you have capacity for that. Having legal observers around for whatever action is going on is very much extremely helpful. That, and I would lastly just expand that to just reiterate a previous point of connect and participate to the extent that you can with whatever nonprofit or other community organizations, alliances, coalitions are happening in your area, near your community, that can help plan and respond for the needs of the community during these times, whether that be securing that the children are safe, whether that be that food is still available for people who, for whatever reason, will not or cannot exit their neighborhood, especially under this climate, medicine, etc. So that's what I would propose or suggest.
Thank you, Sophia. Luis?
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely there are going to be opportunities to engage and activate, supporting efforts by different organizations and grassroots groups and communities. I will just use my time to lift out something that Rossi mentioned before about how so many people claim to not know an immigrant, not know somebody who is affected. I think it is very important because I have seen it in my own family. This is not even funny. People who were undocumented and now are completely quiet, are trying to not talk about it, or you're just trying to, or have completely moved to the other side, and they try to tell people or lie to people, not telling them how is it that they came to be here legally. It is super important to have those conversations. It is super important for everybody to know that they know somebody, because at the end of the day, they are going to be able to push through all this policy that we have discussed today if they find no resistance. Um, Sadly, the people who need to resist more, that they will listen more, are probably not in this panel right now, right? Are the people who are in their networks. So if you know somebody who is your typical Trump voter or you're a stereotypical conservative-minded person, it is time for them to know that they know somebody who is undocumented that could be target for this, and that this affects all of us, and also it affects their pockets, right? But going back a little bit to the media thing, I think that is something that should be lifted up a lot more. What is the economic impact of all this? Because sadly, some people think with their wallets. Thank you.
Jean-Luc?
Yeah, I definitely echo what everyone else said before me as well. Of course, leaning on community and building coalition and strengthening coalition is essential right now. We need each other to get through this. I think another huge thing that anyone can do is just go support local immigrant businesses. Like, go spend your money. Like, go to Buford Highway and buy everything you want there. Go buy all the food. Buy it all. Enjoy a great meal, but also support your immigrant neighbors, because right now they're hurting. And like Luis said, people think with their wallets. And also, it's important to make sure that we keep our immigrant neighbors in business as well, especially as all of this fear is happening right now, too. So, what everyone said, but also go spend money too.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Very important. Rosie?
I feel like Jean-Luc and I are on the same wavelength because that was my thing, is go buy, support local, support small. I think that we really do need to prioritize our immigrant and our Hispanic businesses, because we have to think about the individuals that would typically go support them are going to be the ones that find home and find unity and find community in the shops. And right now, the fear of deportations or being detained is stopping them. So I think we need to really stand strong. I'm a firm believer in the fact that food builds bridges. So I just happen to have a lot more business meetings or a lot more organization meetings in small mom and pop Mexican restaurants and introduce them to real tacos. I'm a firm believer. I mean, I think that's one of the things. And the other thing that I would say to everyone is please carry know your cards with you. Have a simple conversation. Don't just assume that someone needs it. I'm a firm believer that someone will always know someone, but say, hey, do you know this is what's happening? This is a card. If you know someone, please pass it along.
Very important. And Rosario, can you please close us out with the call to action?
Yeah. So I think our silence speaks volumes. There's numerous conversations where we're not speaking up, right? It's uncomfortable. That relative, that friend, that coworker who has just spewed out misinformation facts, right? Who isn't delineating that entering into this country without a immigration status approved by DHS is a civil offense. It's not a criminal offense, right? The narratives against immigrants, the narratives against their likeliness to commit crimes, and whether or not they are contributing to the society, those are the moments, right, where you speak up, you get uncomfortable. As allies, what are you doing to help protect immigrants, right? Are you going to be on the front line of protests, of civil disobedience when those opportunities arise? What are you great at? And who can you organize that is also great at these things with you so that you can research existing organizations. We don't have to go out there and create new ones. But you can be an informal group too, right? I'm for things that are also not institutionalized. I'm for the organic things as long as we also give informed consent to the community members who then we are trying to serve, right? Community members should always know of the risks that they're taking when participating in group activities like protests and other things. I think we need to do these things in considerate ways. And then, just remembering that this time will pass, right? This time will pass, and how silent we are or not is going to be important for us to be able to look for. I'll be honest with you, we were silent the last 4 years. We had the opportunity to abolish ICE. We had the opportunity to end 287G. DHS heads told me and numerous others that no one was asking for that when we were screaming loudly. We need to stop getting comfortable. This country is our country. We don't need to be passively engaged. We need to make sure that we're out there being prideful of the diversity that we have and also protecting our children. Our children don't need to be living the trauma that they're living, right? And so I think, again, at the heart of a lot of things is disinformation. And so I hope each one of us, even if it doesn't feel like a lot, takes the opportunity every single day to debunk those things and to actually promote community belonging. Thank you.
And I'll just add one last, I'm not going to reiterate everything, our panelists beautifully wrapped up with the calls to action, but also mention that this is an issue that affects, multiple communities, not just the Mexican or Latinx community. It also affects the Asian community, Black communities from like Haitian communities, Vietnamese communities. This is something that's going to affect somebody, So, definitely I love the prompt from Jean-Luc and Rosie of like getting to know those local mom and pops and, eat. And because I feel like food does bring us closer together. And so definitely just, having that it's not just going to affect one community, but all of our marginalized communities. A lot of times they themselves don't feel like they belong, and this is another way of othering them, and we can't allow that to happen. We got to be the first ones to not be silent, because I think we'll look back in history and we got to make sure that we are for sure always the ones that were not silent but actually pushing back against their fascist agenda. So that's all I had on my end. I really appreciate you taking the time, and then I'll pass it over to Tanika to wrap us up.
Yes, thank you, Brian. Great panel. I thank you for everyone, the panelists, experts that come on. Thank you so much. I just want to close out by saying that, what Stephanie was saying, there is another way. Continue to be loud. We do have our Justice Day at the Capitol on February 25th. So if you're able to join us, we're going to put in the chat registration information on how you can register and join us for Justice Day at the Capitol. I don't want to repeat anything else that everyone has said. Continue to utilize our voices. I think that's the best way we can continue to be heard and be loud. Our Justice Day is our way to get the community out to get involved. We will have an opportunity to go across the street to speak to our lawmakers about issues that are important to us. But we'll have ongoing engaging with the public. We'll have things at the church. Will be at 201 Presbyterian, Washington Street at Central Presbyterian Church. So we'll have activities at the church as well. So it's an all-day event, free to the public. We'll have breakfast and lunch served from 9 until 3:30.